G20 leaders will try to reach a consensus on a number of issues over the next 2 days in South Korea. But when all is said and done, will they accomplish anything of consequence? Our next guest doesn't have very high expectations. Raghuram Rajan is a former IMF chief economist. He's also author of the book Fault Lines: How Hidden Fractures Still Threaten the World Economy. He's currently a professor at Chicago's Booth School of Business. So there are a fair amount of skeptics out there. You're not alone. But tell me, what do you think should be discussed at the G20? We've had this hyper focus on currency. What can actually get done?
Well, what can get done are the more technical issues. For example, bank capital requirements for the systemically large banks. But even there, they've decided to postpone resolution of those issues into the future. Talking about cross-border resolution of banks, that's an important issue. That's also one where we don't have much agreement so far. The technical issues, however, pale in comparison in terms of importance relative to issues like currencies and the adjustment in demand. And that, I think, is the real pity, because we really need a global agreement on how we're going to manage the transition of demand from the industrial countries to the emerging markets.
It's interesting to try to talk about global coordination at a time when we look at individual countries having, almost wars within themselves about what to do next with economic policy, and very different approaches. You've got austerity in Europe, you've got China trying to tap the brakes. Here in the U.S., you've got this debate about how much more to juice the economy. How do you come to consensus when you've got so much difference at home?
Well, this is the precise problem, right? Because the leaders meeting at the G20 have no capacity to deliver their countries, regardless of what they decide there, because of the very problem you're talking about, the internal dissension. So, for example, China has to move steadily to increasing domestic demand, to moving income to the households, and to allow its exchange rate to appreciate steadily. The U.S. has to move away from being the consumer of first and last resort to improving the productivity of its export industries and to increase the capacity of its workforce. These are big, important issues, and it requires them to, in a sense, build domestic consensus, of which, at this point, certainly in the U.S., there is very little. So the Chinese are saying, you guys are trying to move things too fast. You're trying to do all this quantitative easing. You're keeping monetary policy on hold. That's sending a flood of capital our way. If we allow the renminbi to appreciate at this rate, we'll have problems. And of course, they have a point.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you're describing a situation where the monetary policy is almost in contradiction to the political will. But stepping away from that, I want to get to something. You talk about these fault lines that you think helped to lead to the financial crisis. You point to income inequality, economic inequality in this country as having to lead to economic and financial and political policies that sort of led us to the crisis. What's happened on that front? Because we're looking at income inequality now at record highs in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, things are getting worse. I argue in the book that the push towards low-income housing was, in a sense, a palliative, a way to keep people happy even while their incomes were not keeping pace with the growth of the economy. But if you look at the people who've been hurt by this crisis, unemployment rates are double for people who haven't got a degree. And these are the people who fell behind also in incomes. These are the people whose houses are being repossessed right now. So in terms of who's falling behind, these are the same guys who are falling behind before the crisis. And of course, they want something to be done. At the same time, you've got a reaction from those who think that the government has gotten too big, that we have too much in the way of redistribution policies, who don't like the healthcare reform bill for that reason. And so what we have is political polarization. And I worry about this because, in some sense, the U.S. needs to get its political act together in order to present a stable picture, at the very least, to the bond markets.
So you're describing fault lines essentially getting deeper. Does that mean you see crisis in the near term, an earthquake ahead?
Well, I hope not. But I think the pressures are building. For example, U.S. monetary policy today is driven less by what monetary policy can actually do than by the political imperative of staying on hold while unemployment rates are so high. And so I think we have a politically driven policy structure which could create longer run problems.
Well, employment is a mandate of the Fed, though.
It is, but also longer term growth is something the Fed has to pay attention to.
Yeah.
If in the process of trying to spur employment, you have bubbles building up in the economy and outside, you have a real longer term problem.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. Interesting perspective there, Raghuram Rajan.